Buenos dias. I've known Richard for some time now, after focusing so many of my stories on the impact that policy has had on not just housing, but obviously educational, racial segregation. Several years ago in the movie Won't Back Down, a story, a Hollywood version of a story about a young mother and her desperate research for a good, safe public school, the protagonist screams, "I can't wait for 1,000 more studies about how being poor affects my child's education. But I can tell you that being poor sucks, and my kid can't read." It resonated with me because 30 years of covering poor families in struggling schools, I've come to realize that their plight was deeply rooted in government policies that keep impoverished families and children trapped. And I, for one, can't think of a more important researcher and author who's done more to expose these policies than you, Richard. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you.
I had a question about the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It had some features that said, look, the federal government can tell a school district, you must desegregate. But you argue that we have chipped away, at least the courts have, including the Supreme Court, at any real authority to tell districts you have to have some racial mixing in your schools, regardless of the housing market or where people live. Is that an accurate assessment?
Well, we can try to create some school desegregation with a variety of policies. We can fiddle around with attendance boundaries. We can create magnet schools. We can do some very limited voluntary busing. But most African American children who are most severely disadvantaged in this country live too far distant from middle-class, segregated white communities for that kind of fiddling to exist, to accomplish much without desegregating those communities. The policies I just mentioned, voluntary busing, attendance zone changes, or magnet schools, all they do, if they're successful in the limited way they can be successful, is desegregate the schools in borderline areas. They don't touch the outer ring suburbs, which is the most segregated places in the country. So unless we have residential desegregation, we can't accomplish very much. I'm not saying we can accomplish nothing, but we can't accomplish very much with school desegregation policies alone. The Supreme Court in the 1970s, the early 1970s, evaluated an attempt to desegregate schools in Detroit, in the Detroit metropolitan area, and the court realized that you couldn't have a desegregation remedy that included the entire metropolitan area because it said the suburbs had nothing to do with creating segregation. It was only the city of Detroit that created it. And so we no longer have, under the present Supreme Court, the ability even to do the busing or the magnet schools, the attendance zone boundaries that I just mentioned, if it crosses district lines. I will say this, the present Supreme Court is not going to be there forever, not only because its composition will change over time, hopefully in a better direction, but because the Supreme Court is a political institution and it responds to public pressure in its decisions. It's not something we like to admit because we like to believe that the Supreme Court is somehow an arbiter of the Constitution. But let me just, if I can, I don't want to go on too long with this, but in the 1930s, the Supreme Court denied that the 14th Amendment was really created for the purpose of enshrining African American citizenship and protecting them from any form of discrimination. And it took the position that this 14th Amendment existed only to protect property rights. And so the Supreme Court prohibited child labor laws and minimum wage laws and health and safety laws. It said that these kinds of things prevented children and their employers from negotiating contracts freely with each other. Well, in 1936, President Roosevelt was reelected with an overwhelming majority. He threatened the Supreme Court, and all of a sudden it changed its mind and said, well, maybe we can find that the 14th Amendment permits minimum wage laws and child labor laws and so forth. And the same thing is going to happen, I hope, in the future with respect to residential segregation. It doesn't necessarily require a change in composition. What it does require is, as I said earlier, a civil rights movement that's going to force it to change.
What do you think a room full of people like those we have here, who invested much of their lives and their work in undoing, maybe that's not the best word for it, but trying to undo what you've described as institutional, government-sanctioned segregation. What advice would you have for them? Because I'm assuming that most people who heard you this morning, there's a welling up of anger, of disgust to some degree, to think that in this country we have been unable or unwilling to tackle this enormously important issue. And you say you're hopeful, but once they walk out of this building later today and into next week, what are they supposed to do? How do they fit into this sense of hope?
Well, I speak to a lot of housing groups like this, but I'm speaking to you today not as housing experts, but as citizens, because I think it's in your role as citizens that you have the biggest role to play here, not simply as professionals in the housing field. Let me give you this example. I do travel all over the country, and I can't know very much about every place that I go to, so I apologize if I can't give you an Austin example. But last week I was in Kansas City, and after I gave a talk like I gave earlier today, I was on a panel. I moderated a panel with the mayor of Kansas City. In the course of the discussion, I asked him, we were talking about the difficulty of placing LIHTC developments in most of the areas of Kansas City that were all white, single-family home areas. So I said to him, well, why don't you abolish single-family zoning in the city of Kansas City? And he said, well, I couldn't do it because there's no support in the city council for it. And so I said, well, how many votes do you think you'd have in the city council to abolish single-family zoning in Kansas City? He said, well, 4, maybe 5. And then I asked him, well, how many council people are there? And he said 13. So I said to him, well, so if you got that 5th, you'd only need 2 more to abolish single-family zoning. Think about it and tell me, of those remaining 8 council districts from which you need to get 2, which ones would be most likely, not likely, but more likely than others, to flip if there was enough community pressure to flip on this issue? And he said, well, Districts 4 and District 6 maybe. And then I spoke to the audience. It was about as large as this one. And I said, how many of you live in District 4 and District 6? And about 40 people raised their hands. Well, if we can start a civil rights movement around racial segregation in the city of Kansas City, I'd be able to have an organizer go to Districts 4 and District 6 and organize committees to begin to make life uncomfortable for the city council people in those areas who support single-family zoning. So that's the kind of thing, and I don't have a local Austin example to give you, but it's in our role as citizens that we're going to be most powerful, because, as I said, the policies are well known. What's absent is the political will to do it, and we can create that political will.
A reminder that we are now putting up on the screen here a way for you to join in, and if you have a question or comment, preferably a question for Richard, short of seeing one. In doing stories out of Louisville, back with when the Seattle and Louisville case reached the Supreme Court, and then out of Charlotte, Mecklenburg, where busing was a huge issue back in the 70s and 80s. I came away feeling that, talking about anger, Black communities were angry And I remember talking to parents who would say, I can't wait for either that city council or that county executive or the political system to address segregated schools and my inability to put my kid in the best school I think is possible. And I remember hearing black preachers in Louisville saying, look, the burden is on us to take our kids way out of their neighborhoods and put them in supposedly racially mixed schools. Never mind that many of these kids were eventually segregated within the schools themselves. Magnet programs were often an example of that. So when you look at the arguments that some black activists have made, which is, just give me a good school in my neighborhood, even if it's an all-black school, do you think that that is, I don't know whether it would be a trend, but do you think that is an answer? Let's just get the best schools, the best teachers in these neighborhoods, and yeah, let's mobilize to make segregated housing a thing of the past. But in the meantime, my kid is suffering. You're going to lose another generation or more if you don't address the quality of education that they're getting in these all-black neighborhoods. How does that fit into the argument that you're making?
Well, first of all, I'd say that the way in which we evaluate good schools is misguided. There are many schools in low-income neighborhoods that are better than schools in suburban neighborhoods because they add value to children to a greater extent than higher performing schools in suburban white neighborhoods do. You know, suburban white neighborhood schools have high test scores from children who would get high test scores no matter where they went to school because of the social and economic advantages that their parents have. Having said that, it's certainly true that you can create schools for black children of highly motivated parents who can enforce high standards on their children and take those children out of regular schools. It's the same thing white parents do. White parents try to move to schools where the most advantaged white families live. African Americans can try, like charter schools, can try to create schools that concentrate the most advantaged African American children, the most highly motivated parents in those schools. The result, of course, is, and I'm not arguing against that, it's the same thing white parents do. But it does have the effect of making the remaining schools, that the regular schools that children remain in, even more disadvantaged than they were because it concentrates the most disadvantaged children even further. It's a short-term solution. The long-term solution has to be desegregation. I see a question here that says that you know, black children don't have to be near white children in order to learn. And it depends what you mean by a high-quality school and high-quality education. We have a diverse society. Children have to learn to work with others of other races, to create collaborative relationships. It's not easy. In the busing era that you talked about, there were many, many black children who were bused who had terrible experiences. They suffered what we now call microaggressions. They were segregated within schools. Many of those children who are now adults, the busing era took place in the 70s and 80s. Many of them are in their 50s and 60s now. They say they would never put their children through such an experience. It was a terrible experience. But when you look at the data, what you find is that despite the hardships, and these children bore a disproportionate share of the hardships. The white children didn't bear the hardships. The black children who were bused did. Despite those hardships, the most successful, accomplished African-American leaders in this country today were products of the busing era. And the data show that children who were bused have far better outcomes in terms of educational outcomes, college graduation, marriage rates, less criminality, less engagement with the criminal justice system than demographically identical black children who were not bused to desegregated schools. So I'm not saying this is an easy thing to solve.
We're almost out of time, but I do want to get to a few of these questions. You know, there's a question here about not in my backyard. You know, what do we do about that? I mean, racial attitudes rather than policies. And a very legitimate question, certainly more as relevant as it is in Texas, and that is the segregation of English language learners, predominantly Latino children, versus black children. Can you address either one of these? First, the not in my backyard attitude that often is an obstacle, but also, is the segregation of ELLs, English language learners, comparable to the segregation of black children?
Well, those are really two questions.
Right.
Let me try. I know I'm taking too much time, but these are complicated issues. I'll try to be quite quick. The not in my backyard. We have a serious political problem in addressing this, and that is many people think that if only the Democratic Party were in power, we would begin to solve these problems. But the Democratic Party is the biggest obstacle to this, to solving these problems.
The Democratic Party.
The Democratic Party.
Okay.
The Democratic Party has become a coalition in this country of minority families and suburban, well-educated families. The suburban, well-educated families are the biggest roadblock to solving this problem, because you could, you know, many of the Democratic candidates had all these fancy proposals for addressing segregation, even though they didn't use racial language to talk about it. But the biggest obstacle are these suburban communities, which will say, yes, we believe in desegregation, just not in my community. And until we can somehow like in those Kansas City districts, make life uncomfortable in those districts to maintain that attitude, we're not going to make much progress. So I think we have to abandon any kind of fantasy that simply by electing Democrats we're going to be able to redress segregation. So far as English language learners, well, we don't segregate English language learners by policy in separate schools. They're in separate schools because, again, immigrant neighborhoods are concentrated neighborhoods. And, you know, I've written much, as you know, about bilingual education, how essential it is to help recent immigrant children become successful. But immigrant families are in an entirely different situation than the historic segregation that I've been talking about. Immigrant families have always settled in homogeneous, low-income neighborhoods with access to job networks and cultural resources and language spoken. And then over the next few generations, they tend to move out of those neighborhoods and become part of the broader society. And that is happening to a great extent for Latino immigrants today. If you look at all the data, you find that on any outcomes, the whites are at the top, the African Americans are at the bottom, and the Latinos are in between. And if you were able to disaggregate those Latinos by generation, you would find that the third and fourth generation Latino immigrants are much closer to the white outcomes than they are to the African Americans. You know, a third generation and beyond Latinos marry non-Latinos in this country. African Americans have been here for scores of generations, and the intermarriage rates are not nearly at that level. So I think we need to, in talking about the Mexican immigrant in particular and Latin American immigrant population in particular, we need to disaggregate by generation in order to really understand the problems that we're facing. It's very different for African Americans.
Yeah, Gary Orfield at UCLA talks a lot about language ghettos in these communities where it's predominantly non-English speaking, and how that in itself becomes almost an underground environment in which children are living where they don't feel they're part of this country, where they're growing up in an isolation, the kind of isolation that isolates them from economic and educational opportunity.
But as you get into the third generation, that's no longer true. And my ancestors came here into a language ghetto. Italian Americans came here into language ghettos, and over the course of subsequent generations, they were able to emerge into the broader society. And to a somewhat lesser extent today, the same thing is true of immigrants from Mexico and Central America.
I need to ask our minders whether we're out of time. 5 more minutes. Was there a question here that anybody asked that you wanted to address in particular? I know that we were not able and won't be able to get to all of them. But maybe one of the questions actually is, what community would you cite as an example of the kind of change that we would all like to see?
Well, there are many, many communities that are making small progress in this area, and it needs to be accentuated. I said before that they were placing most LIHTC developments, for example, in low-income segregated neighborhoods, but not all, and some communities are doing better in creating mixed-income developments throughout metropolitan areas. Here in Texas, as you know, the Inclusive Communities Project of Dallas successfully argued in the Supreme Court that it could be a constitutional violation for Dallas to place most of its affordable housing, already low-income segregated neighborhoods. And as a result of that decision, Dallas has been doing a somewhat better job of placing affordable housing throughout the metropolitan area. The state of New Jersey has a fair share plan, which requires every community in New Jersey to provide housing opportunities for its fair share of the low-income population in its metropolitan area. Montgomery County is outside of Washington, D.C., is one of the best examples. It's a very, very affluent county, has an inclusionary zoning program that requires any development to have, I think, 15% of its units available for moderate income workforce housing, and then 1/3 of those is purchased by the Public Housing Authority of Montgomery County for public housing eligible residents. It's been a very successful program. Of course, new development is a tiny share of the overall county, so it's still basically a segregated county. So there are many, many examples of modestly successful programs, but in terms of a mass movement towards this result, we're not doing nearly enough.
Although I have to say, Richard, the latest headline in the Washington Post about Montgomery County is in-school segregation and how there are impediments in place in many schools having to do really with teachers' attitudes towards black children that have been more integrated, but that continue to perpetuate this notion that for some reason these black kids are inferior intellectually. I mean, it just makes you wonder, you know, it's almost like you're spinning your wheels. You begin to chip away at those institutional barriers, and yet when these children reach school, you still find more obstacles and hurdles.
Well, you know, I want to disagree with you a bit on that, Claudio. You know, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. It is not the case that the children in Montgomery County who are in these integrated environments are no better off than they would have been if it were not for this program. They are certainly, everything you describe is true, but I'm sure you're familiar with the RAND study, which shows that children who are in these public housing owned units within these broader diverse developments in Montgomery County perform far better than children in public housing who are not moved into these kinds of, they don't perform as well as the white children. You're absolutely right. There's still segregation in these schools. There's still all of the other problems that confront them. But it's a form of progress, and we're not going to solve this problem all at once.
We sure aren't. It's time to wrap up. Thank you, Richard. Thank you. And as Richard has said, you should approach him and ask him more about some of the things that he's involved with on this issue. Thank you all. I guess we're due for a break, and then we're going to continue or resume this with our panel. Thank you.